Welcome to this presentation on writing for radio. And although the title speaks about radio, pretty much everything you're going to learn here about writing for radio really applies to writing for other types of broadcasting, whether it be TV or some other digital media that you might be creating. So everything really applies to all forms of broadcast writing. But we're talking kind of about radio here, and we're going to hear from an expert in radio talking about writing as well too. So this first slide here, this is a quote from a fellow named Steve Allen. You may not know who this person was, but perhaps your parents or maybe even grandparents might know who he was. He was a famous actor, comedian, host, presenter on radio and television, and a bit of trivia, he was the very first host of the Tonight Show way back in 1954, the show that Jimmy Fallon is still doing to this day as the current host of that show. So that's a talk show that's been going on for long before I was even born. So that's quite a ways. Anyway, he famously said that radio is the theater of the mind. And although video is everywhere these days and radio is often just news or music to a great many people, if you think about radio in terms of CBC storytelling or serialized programs or podcasts, that's kind of what Steve Allen was talking about at the time. It's in that absence of visuals that you have to use your mind to draw the pictures that are being painted by the words that are coming over the radio. So radio becomes a theater in the mind that your mind fills in those missing pictures, and it can only do that based on words that are illustrative, that are active, and that are going to create those pictures in your mind. So that's really, in a sense, what broadcast writing has to be about. It has to paint a picture. It has to tell a story in the absence of pictures, just by words alone, and that can be a bit of a tricky thing to do. So writing for radio, there's some basic principles, key principles you have to keep in mind. And those are that you have to keep your writing simple. You have to keep your writing conversational, which is something I've said to a few of you in our meet and greet sessions. And you also have to keep your writing into the active voice. And also keep it tight. And by tight, we mean as few words as possible and short, simple words as well too. And we'll talk about each of these in succession in a few moments. But those are the key things. So simple, conversational, active voice, and nice, concise, tight writing. So the first key principle that we've talked about is keeping your writing simple and conversational. And what we mean by that is you want to get straight to the point. So this idea about talking to your friend, if you heard a story that your friend hasn't heard and they're asking what that's about, you want to get to the point. You want to dive straight in. You don't want to dilly-dally or go off on a tangent. If any Simpsons fans are out there, you don't want to tell a Grandpa Simpson story. You want to get right to it, tell the most important details in an interesting way, and move on. And clarity is the key. So make sure there are no confusing sentence structures or big words. We want to use informal words. We want to keep it casual. We don't want to throw in any words that are legalese or bureaucratic speak or police lingo, words that ordinary people might not know if they're not in those professions. We want to be nice and clear about it. So very informal words. If there's a word that you have to look up because you're not sure about the proper usage, don't use it, because there's a good chance somebody else might be confused by that word as well too. And because this is radio we're talking about, there's no rewind button. You only have one chance to get it right. You got one shot, as Eminem might say, because there's no rewind button on radio, right? So it goes by. If you didn't understand it, you got to wait another 15 minutes until the next newscast or an hour or what have you. So don't confuse the listener. Keep everything simple and let them understand it the first time through. So whenever you're having difficulty finding a simple or conversational word for your news writing or news copy, as we say, one of the best places to go is that little book you bought called Capson Spelling. And in there's a very cleverly titled, simple, clear section called plain words. And there you can find different words that do the same job as perhaps a longer word, a more formal word. So you can see some examples there. Instead of saying abbreviate, you would say shorten or cut. Instead of accommodate, say there was a fire and a bunch of people got put out of their apartment and they had to go find alternate housing. Instead of saying they had to be accommodated elsewhere, you would say they had to be housed, they had to be sheltered, they had to be put up somewhere. So stuff like that. And it's a great resource. If you go into that little book, you should always really have it beside you when you're writing on your laptop, because it's a very handy resource to look up stuff. And it's been around for years and years and years. So common words that trip people up or that people want to avoid using, there's always a good chance whatever word you're looking for, it's going to be in there, whether it's how to spell it or whether it's how to avoid using that word and find an alternative word. So check that out, Plain Words in your Capstone Spelling Book. It's a very handy reference. So in terms of how would you write something, that is a plain language and gets rid of informal words or large words. Here's an example of, say, a breaking news story, like a fire that perhaps is happening somewhere. And the first sentence reads, "An exceptionally large fire devastated the structure." And there's nothing particularly inaccurate about that. I mean, it's probably an accurate description of what happened. It was a big fire. It devastated the structure. But that's not really the way you would speak. Have you ever said that to your friend? Oh, it was an exceptionally large fire and it just devastated the structure. Not the way most people talk. What you might say something like, oh, it was a huge fire and it just destroyed the building. So that's how you should write it. A huge fire destroyed the building. Not only is it simpler, but it's also shorter and it's also more active and there's more sort of exciting action words in there as well too. So that's a good tip for you. If you write something out and you're not sure if it's in proper broadcast style, read it out loud to yourself. And if it doesn't sound like something you might say out loud, then you probably should try again and use simpler language. But remember, simple doesn't mean boring, as we'll see in a minute as well too. Simple just means shorter, clearer, but still interesting and active voice. Here's another example that often pops up. So when you're writing for broadcast and somebody has died, that's what we say. We say the person died. We don't say that they passed away or that they passed on or they became the late such and such a person or they've left us or they've gone to the pearly gates. We just say they died. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's to the point. It's not, you don't want to get poetic or take any literary license with news writing. You just want to state the facts. And as harsh as that may sound, that's the way it's preferred to be written. You just say they died, and there's no two ways around that, right? You say that, you know what happened. There's no second guessing on that. So another thing you want to think about is contractions. So contractions are where we stick those two words together and put a comma somewhere in the middle of them. So do not becomes don't. It is becomes it's. Cannot become can't. Will not become won't. And that. So contractions are good. So you may have been told previously in formal writing we don't use contractions. In news writing we do. We do because it makes it shorter, but it also makes it more conversational and less formal. So it's the way we typically speak when we're saying sentences. We don't typically say, oh, if somebody asks you if you want to go hang out with them tonight or go to the pub or get some wings or something, you don't say, oh, I'm sorry, I cannot go out with you tonight. We just say, oh, sorry, I can't. That's the way we speak, and that's the way it should be written as well. So here's a video, and this kind of gives an example of what we mean about why you want to use plain, simple language and how that really works for most people when they're listening to something. So watch this.
We all know the scene. Dorothy closes her eyes and repeats the Good Witch's mantra. No coordinates exist like one's domicile. No coordinates exist like one's domicile. No coordinates exist like one's domicile. Only Dorothy doesn't say that. She says 5 one-syllable words. There's no place like home. Each a word you probably learned in your first year of speaking. Each perfectly concise. It's not that L. Frank Baum didn't have a thesaurus. It's that in most cases, $10 words fail. Would Aerosmith have had a hit with Ambulate This Direction? Probably not. Would Patrick Henry have ignited a revolution by saying, provide me with liberty or bestow upon me fatality? Unlikely. When it comes to words, bigger isn't always better. $10 words are rendered worthless if they're not understood. That's not to say every piece of literature should be written at a 4th grade reading level, but it is important to know your audience. If you're a novelist, your audience is probably expecting 300 pages of vivid descriptors. At the very least, they're expecting you won't use the same 50 words to fill those pages. But most of us don't have the luxury of a captive audience. We're competing against a whole world of distractions, and we're fighting for space in an attention span that continues to shrink across generations. So get to the point already. Variety may be the spice of life, but brevity is its bread and butter. So when it comes to $10 words, save your money and buy a Scrabble board.
Okay, so let's talk about now coming out of what active voice means. So when we're talking about the active voice in news writing, it means always having someone or something doing something to someone or someone else. Now, it might sound a bit weird or possibly rude, as I've explained it there, but here's an example of what I mean. So there's active voice and then there's passive voice. So in the passive voice here, you can write about a crime story here. You can say, the car was stolen by the bank robber. That's a passive way of writing it. And that's because the person who's doing the thing, the bank robber, is at the end of the sentence here, and the thing that was acted upon, the thing that was stolen being the car, is at the beginning. So that's reversed. That's flipped from the way it should be. So in the example below, you can see the active voice. The bank robber stole the car. Now the bank robber, he's the guy that's doing something, so it's at the beginning. The car is at the end. The verb is in the middle, and that's the way it should be written. Not that the car was acted upon by somebody, in this case the bank robber, and was stolen by the bank robber. You want to say the bank robber stole the car. That's an example of passive writing. We always want the action, and we always want the person, the actor, the thing that is doing something at the beginning of the sentence, then the verb, and then what it was that was acted upon at the end of the sentence. Hopefully that makes sense to you. We'll put some perhaps some samples in one of your assignments for this week, and you'll get an idea of that. But it's always something or someone is doing something to something else. The bank robber stole the car. The hairstylist was raising money for charity. Examples like that. You probably think of a bunch of them, and as I say, we'll get some other ones for you. And there's also something else coming here, which I think you're going to explain a little bit more about that too, about why we always want to think about having action and using this active voice. So here's a video by a guy who's going to take us through that a little bit and explain what it means to write in the active voice and how we can go about doing that. So please watch this.
When writing for the ear, it's best if your copy is linear. You don't want viewers to have to unravel a complex sentence they've just heard. The best way to accomplish that is to write in what's called the active voice. If you write in the active voice, not only will you write straight line copy, but you will also write tighter copy, and your stories will be more interesting. On the surface, active voice is a simple concept, but actually doing it is something else entirely. Learning how to write in the active voice takes practice, so I don't expect that by the end of this video you will start writing all of your copy in the active voice. To explain active voice, I'll start by showing you some sentences written in the passive voice. The men were rescued by the Coast Guard. The house was damaged by floodwaters. The dog was bitten by the snake. You might notice one obvious thing that's common to all of these sentences and one that's not so obvious. The obvious thing is to be verbs. In these instances, the to be verbs are was and were. The other, more important but less obvious common trait is that the receiver of the action appears before the verb, and the actor, the one doing the action, comes after the verb. That's backwards. That latter point is the toughest active voice concept to grasp. Putting the receiver of the action ahead of the verb and the actor after the verb is confusing. Your goal is to use linear writing. You don't want your viewers to have to replay what you wrote to understand it. It's easy to turn those sentences into the active voice. Simply rearrange them. Put the actor before the verb and the receiver of the action after the verb. The Coast Guard rescued the men. The Coast Guard is the actor, the thing taking action. The men are the receivers of the action. Floodwaters damaged the house. Floodwaters are the actor, the house is the receiver. The snake bit the dog. Once again, the snake is the actor, the dog is the receiver. Putting the actor before the verb and the receiver of the action after the verb makes it easier for the viewer to understand the story. It also shortens your sentences. In each case, switching things around meant that I removed the to be verb. If there is a to be verb in a sentence, it's probably passive voice. To be verbs are am, is, was, were, are, or been. So, does this mean that active voice sentences never have a to be verb? Consider slightly different takes on the previous examples. The Coast Guard is rescuing the men. Floodwaters are damaging the house. The snake is biting the dog. All have so-called to-be verb helpers, are and is, but they are all in the active voice because, you guessed it, the actor comes before the verb and the receiver of the action follows the verb. So, should you always write in the active voice? No. For example, you wouldn't say, his mother gave birth to him in 1990. That's active voice, but it's not conversational. Instead, you'd say, he was born in 1990. That common phrase, he was born, is a less common and less obvious instance of the passive voice. When a sentence has no actor, it's usually passive. For example, the ship was towed to the pier. The missing actor is a tugboat. That kind of passive voice is harder to identify and usually conversational anyway. Bottom line, when you write, strive to put the actor ahead of the verb and the receiver of the action after the verb. And watch out for to be verbs. They frequently are signs of the passive voice.
All right. So that brings us to our next section. By the way, that guy had a pretty good voice too, didn't he? Obviously, you can tell that guy works in broadcasting. So our next tip is writing tightly. And what we mean by that simply, as it says there, is using the least amount of words while still relaying the information clearly and accurately. So fewest number of words, but still very clear and very correctly written. So basically, this means just sort of ruthlessly eliminating all words that are not needed. And this can be tricky if you're used to essay writing where you're desperately trying to hit 1,500 words or whatever minimum length is set by the teacher. There's no padding allowed in TV writing. We want to take out any word that is not necessary and eliminate it. So there's no redundancies, there's no repetition. It's just as simple and short as it can possibly be. So writing is basically you're doing a lot of revising, a lot of editing until you get the hang of this. And then once you've got the hang of it, it'll come a little bit more naturally and become second nature. But it is going to take practice, so don't feel bad if I've given you some feedback later on and that you're still putting in extra words. It takes a while to get used to that. It took a while for me. I came from a newspaper background and then went into TV, and I was used to writing longer and using some bigger words sometimes as well too. So it's a bit of a trick to get into that mindset. But once you get it, it becomes kind of enjoyable to write that. It's almost like a challenge. See how short you can make your words and still convey everything that you need to accurately and clearly. And writing for radio, as we just really talked about, it's a process of elimination. It's getting rid of any extraneous stuff, constantly editing out things that are not needed, and to get it as short and simple as possible. And one tip to do that towards writing tight is to make sure that you're only really keeping one idea or two ideas max per sentence, and keeping your paragraphs when you actually have paragraphs, because sometimes radio stories in particular are so short, you're not really writing paragraphs as you would think of them in an essay. But confine yourself to one or two thoughts maximum per sentence. If you have more than that, you're probably writing too much, and you're going to confuse people. So some examples here. Each and every child received a gift. Just say each child or every child. Either one of those works, but both of them together is redundant. The scene was a terrible tragedy. Well, tragedies are terrible. That's kind of the definition of a tragedy. So you don't need to say it was a terrible tragedy. You just say the scene was a tragedy. And there's the point there about the one or two ideas per sentence and keeping paragraphs short. So a good way to watch out for this, if you find yourself writing more than, say, 30 words in a sentence or so, you might want to try and take another edit at that and cut down some words. Because you got to remember, somebody has to read what you're writing. It may be you or maybe another person, but somebody's going to be reading your writing. And if you have a run-on sentence, they're going to run out of breath at some point, and have to take a big intake of air, and that doesn't sound good on radio. So another good way to see if what you've written is tight and concise is to read them aloud yourself. So and this will really make you sort of stop and notice any informal words, long sentences, any missing contractions that you could have used, and any words that might trip you up too. So if you're tripping up over your own words that you wrote, imagine how that's going to be for somebody else who hasn't seen those words and is trying to read them on air for the first time, perhaps without a lot of rehearsal, or perhaps with no rehearsal if it's a news story that's gone straight to them and they haven't had a chance to read it. Another tip you can try is pretend that you're writing, say, a notice in a newspaper, like, where they put a notice in for graduation or birth notices. The newspapers charge for those things by word, so every word costs you money. So try and pretend that you're being charged like $1 per word, and think of it as a challenge to yourself to try and write the cheapest sentence you can. And that's what I kind of like to do. Try and think of it like it's a challenge to see how short and simple you can make it and still keep it in that active voice. And it's a tricky thing to do, but if you can do that well, then you become a very sought-after news writer, because it's definitely a talent that people can acquire, and if you become good at it, then people want to keep you around for sure. So that's it for the presentation. Thanks for watching, and please move on to the next part of this module if you have time right now, but make sure you get through it before the end of the week. Okay, thanks.